What do you seek from God and from His holy church?
The blessing of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit with this monastic community.
Thanks be to God. Rise in the name of the Lord. Christ has said, "Greater love than this no one has, than to lay down their lives for their friends." Do you now wish to make of your whole life a gift of love to God and your sisters?
Yes, Reverend Father, with the help of God and of the sisters.
Do you wish, by obedience, stability, and conversion of life, to advance in the school of the Lord's service until death? Hi, I'm Evan B. Howard, and today I'm bringing you a lecture on monastic vows and the intentional dimension of religious life. Now, the subject of monastic vows may seem like a really obscure topic, but I hope today that by the end of this lecture you will catch a glimpse of just how relevant this topic is. At the start of this video, you witnessed a sample of the profession ceremony, which is common to many religious orders. In my lecture today, I want to address 4 questions of this kind of ceremony. Where did it come from? Which has to do with the history of old monastic vows. What do the old monastic vows mean? Which has to do with the interpretation of old monastic vows. How do new monastic expressions embody this dimension? Which has to do with the practice of contemporary new monastic movements. And finally, what is the significance of these historic vows for Christians today? And that's the question of the value of monastic vows, old and new. You see, I think that we are facing 2 crises simultaneously in late Western Christian culture today. The first is a crisis of values. Now, without pontificating on the nature of postmodernity or the post-Christian culture, I simply want to tell you what I am seeing these days. I think that many people today have little or no mooring for their values. People simply don't know how to find or to build a thoughtfully considered system of values. Consequently, many of us simply live our lives to escape boredom, or almost not intentionally asking questions, or floating with whatever people are doing and sacrificing ourselves to the advertising gods. These are the kinds of things we find ourselves floating rather than considering our values. Others have, I think, adopted the default values of emerging society, perhaps even unconsciously. Something like what sociologist Christian Smith calls moralistic therapeutic deism, or something like that. We believe in something, and we may be outraged at things we consider wrong, but it's really hard to define what is just right, and particularly why. But in the midst of all this, what I see increasingly emerging is that many people are truly longing for real values. We want to make a difference in the world, to make our lives and others' lives better somehow. And for Christians, this longing ends up being a search for a system of Christian values that appreciates not merely eternity out there, but also the here and the now. We want values not merely that we believe, but also values that we can live. And we live in the midst of this crisis of values. Now, at the same time, we are experiencing a second crisis, a crisis of commitment. We have experienced, a lot of us have experienced the failures of commitment. Marriage vows have ended in painful divorces. Churches that proclaim their unity have collapsed in the middle of ugly splits. Scandals from every sector of society have left us burned and shy to trust authority. And yet, at the same time, I am seeing a sincere longing for good, solid, stable, ordinary, celebrated commitment. We want to commit, but we don't know how. A crisis of value, a crisis of commitment. And here is my point. I am convinced that the notion of Christian vows, as understood within the historic monastic tradition, addresses both of these crises. Vows are one of the most essential elements of religious life. Indeed, many dictionaries, if you look up religious life or monasticism or something, they will define it as people who have professed to a certain kind of vow and are living according to it. And this brings us to our first question. Where did monastic vows come from? There are a few different terms that communicate the idea of vow or oath in the Old Testament. For the most part, these terms refer to an act of consecrating or devoting to the service of God. Both objects and people can be vowed to God's service. And, of course, the key illustration for monastic life is the discussion of the Nazirite vow in Numbers chapter 6. The making of vows and the fulfilling of them is never commanded, but it is often encouraged in the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms. The Old Testament scriptures offer also a clear warning that if we make a vow, we had better keep it. The New Testament refers to oaths, to swearing, and to other acts and promises of consecration. Of course, Paul himself and his companions clearly made some kind of temporary vows of consecration, as we see in Acts chapter 18, verse 18, and chapter 21, verse 23. The New Testament, which is frequently discussed regarding vows, is Matthew chapter 5, 33 through 37, which to some appears to be a condemnation of vows. Well, without getting into all the detail, let me just simply say that this particular passage is not speaking of vows of request or dedication, but rather this passage speaks of legal situations where an oath is used to give evidence of the veracity of one's testimony. Now, while it makes no specific mention of vows, the discussion of widows in 1 Timothy 5, I think, opens the door to recognizing a subgroup within the church which remains unmarried and without a worldly career, and whose clear commitment is to serve the work of Christ. It did not take long before both widows and virgins were recognized as distinct and consecrated communities within the Church of Christ. So right from the start, we have the beginnings of a group of committed, consecrated people, the widows and the virgins. In 3rd century Syria, we find evidence of what are called the sons and daughters of the covenant, believers who at baptism also promised themselves to a celibate and consecrated life of special service to God within their local congregation. The letters and the long rule of 4th century Bishop Basil of Caesarea, by the way, these what are called rules actually were really FAQs, frequently asked questions, that were compiled by his followers, and then you have this list of questions and answers. Anyway, Basil's long rules give us the first solid picture of the public profession of commitment for male religious. Then if you move on, in the 5th and 6th centuries, both Caesareus in his rule for nuns and Coptic monastic leader Shenuot, both independent of each other, describe similar commitments that nuns and monks would make upon their entry to religious life. One of the most influential early monastic legislations of vows is found in chapter 58 of the Benedictine Rule on the procedure for receiving brothers. This chapter outlines a process of initial commitment, difficult testing, personal renunciation, a public promise, and all of that process is a process that we see reflected later on in nearly every monastic community since. Now, it's interesting to note that these brothers do not make vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the vows we think of as characteristic vows of the religious life. Rather, the rule states that the entering brother promises, quote, stability, fidelity to monastic life, or conversion of morals is another language, and obedience. Now, much has been written about these phrases, and I hope to address the monastic vows and their particularity in upcoming videos later on. In the early Middle Ages, say through the 6th through the 11th century, the evidence for vows and ceremonies really varies from place to place. For example, Catherine Tom, in her book Early Irish Monasticism, summarizes the evidence for Irish monasticism by saying that, quote, the evangelical virtues of obedience, poverty, and chastity that later became the vows of committed religious were not so evident in most of the Irish rules discussed. Now, in 1221, with what's called the 1221 Rule of Francis of Assisi, however, we find explicitly in the opening sentences of the opening chapter the pronouncement that, and I quote, the rule and life of the friars is to live in obedience, in chastity, and without property. There the three appear for the first time, all together like that. The Dominican friars followed suit in this commitment, and Dominican scholar Thomas Aquinas, in his monumental Summa Theologica, discussed commitment to religious life under this very rubric. Now, things took a turn with the Protestant Reformation. In 1522, Martin Luther wrote a treatise for people considering leaving behind their vows. Luther's treatise, Judgment on Monastic Vows, was a scathing critique, not only of the practice of monastic consecration, but, to his perception, also regarding the very principles on which the concept of monastic vows were built. John Calvin followed suit with an attack on monastic vows in his Institutes of the Christian Religion. Yet, Protestants could not avoid the use of some language later on to use in describing their devout commitments to God. Consequently, in time, we hear the language of like covenants or resolutions or promises or things like that. Roman Catholics after the Reformation and after the Council of Trent and thereon continued the Thomistic understanding of the three primary vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, expanding them occasionally, as for example when the Jesuits committed themselves to a fourth vow, absolute availability to the Supreme Pontiff or Pope. And if we wanted to, we could get into the mess of clarifying such things as simple and solemn vows and all kinds of other fine distinctions. But there is no time for that now. It actually gets complicated at times. So, now with a sense of the history of old monastic vows, let's take a look at how new monastic groups are expressing this kind of thing. Do new monastic communities take vows? If so, to what? As I have visited with many groups over the years, and as I've read the literature from all the various monastic networks, what I see is a couple of things. there's both a recasting of the traditional vows, and then there's kind of an expanding of these vows to incorporate, I think, a real commitment to real values today, but yet without a whole lot of use of the term. Rather than vows, new monastic expressions tend to talk about marks, or commitments, or values, or something similar to that. Thus, for example, if you wanted to join a new monastic community associated with Urban Neighbors of Hope, you might be asked about your commitment to community, your commitment to the inner city, your commitment to an incarnational way of life. The communities that collaborated to write schools for conversion identified 12 marks that seem to characterize many of their circle. Similarly, the Order of Mission in England has articulated a set of life shapes that summarizes the core values of their community. You see, and while each new monastic expression identifies its own set of commitments expected of its followers, I recognize a family of common values that seems to bond some of these various groups together. Terms like community, missional, incarnational, prophetic are common among many of the groups. And along with these terms, I also see kind of a recasting of the late medieval synthesis, those three key terms. The vow of poverty is rediscovered through a commitment to appropriate simplicity. The vow of chastity is reinterpreted as purity or fidelity in either single or married life. The vow of obedience is often cast in terms of like humility, which allows for a more democratic approach to community authority. Some new monastic communities actually do have ceremonies to affirm new members as they make their commitments to these things. For others, it's a bit more informal. In sum, I do not think that new monasticism has given up on vows. But neither do I think that they have simply brought the whole old-time practice back in toto. Indeed, I think what we're doing here is we're exploring what it means to make real commitment to real values. That's what we're trying to look for. And my guess is that this is going to take some process and a little bit of mistakes here and there to work its way out. But I have much hope in this process, and even more hope in the spirit that lies behind the process. So, what then is the meaning of values for today? The meaning of vows for today? One final comment. Specifically, the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. I'll return to those three kind of what they call traditional vows. A number of years ago, I got to thinking about the failure of leaders, political leaders, financial leaders, and unfortunately, church leaders. Personal collapse after personal collapse. I could probably add sports figures and media figures as well to this. Why? Why all these collapses? What are the pressures that break these figures, these people down? And then I realized money, sex, and power. These were the big ones. So many leaders fell to the pressures of money, sex, and power. And then it was like, oh, bingo, wake up, Evan. I realized money, sex, and power. Poverty, chastity, obedience. Simplicity, purity, humility. Whoa! The basic, historic, Christian, monastic vows are a powerful countercultural statement in our society today. To live a life of voluntary simplicity is to shout an Amos-like prophetic voice against the consumerism that chokes the fruit of the kingdom from our church. To maintain a faithful and a pure sexual life is to proclaim the riches of a union of persons that is much, much larger than simply making love. To abandon our need for credential and position for the sake of humble service without any need for recognition is a radical stance in the midst of our look out for number one culture. I think we need new nuns and monks today. I think we need new semi-monks and semi-nuns today. We need this for our own sake, for the sake of the church, and for the sake of the world. The value of vows is only one example. May you, whoever you are, have a wonderful day.